I'm answering a very specific question, which is how to make a hot sauce from lacto fermented dried peppers. So first up, I have dried Chile de arbol, 2 ounces, and then I have a 1/4 ounce of pequin. Very, very good, delicious peppers, relatively spicy too, right? Chile de arbol normally sit around 60,000 Scoville, and then these pequin peppers around 40,000 on the Scoville heat unit. The sauce is gonna have really good flavor, really good body from the fermentation process, and it's gonna have an overall decent spice level. So with these peppers, we need to be removing the seeds, because if you leave the seeds in the peppers and you make a sauce with it, you can end up with a bitter sauce, especially with dried peppers. The easiest way to do this is cut the pepper in half and then shake out the seeds. I'm just kind of rolling them in my finger and dropping the seeds out. I've got a whole lot of peppers to do that with, but you definitely need to do it. If you're sensitive to capsaicin, then I recommend wearing cloves when you're touching these peppers too, because they, do have a pretty decent amount of spiciness to them. This is the most tedious part of making the whole sauce. The rest of it is very smooth sailing. Same thing with these pequin peppers, you need to remove the seeds. So same thing, just kind of cutting them in half and then removing the seeds. A lot of times when you cut these peppers in half, then the seeds will kind of just pop out on their own. Depending on the size of the garlic cloves, you could do like 7 or 10 of them. I like having a lot of garlic in my hot sauces. I have a tendency to use a lot of garlic because garlic's awesome. So the garlic, you want to give them a smash on the cutting board, just a light smash. Doing that is going to extract a little bit of the juices out of the garlic, and it's going to help, speed up that fermentation process. Dried chilies are a little more difficult to get the fermentation process started. I have a trick to show you how to make that happen, and using some fresh ingredients to it. The lactobacillus on the garlic and the shallots really is going to be helpful, being that they're fresh. And then I'm also going to be using the brine from this previous ferment. If you don't have a previous ferment, then you can buy some raw sauerkraut from the grocery store and then just use that liquid. That should work perfectly fine too, because that has the good probiotics in it, which is the live lactic acid bacteria, the lactobacillus, right? Makes sense? But I kind of like the thought of using the brine from a previous fermented pepper batch, because we're fermenting peppers, not sauerkraut, you know what I mean? You need to have a little bowl to keep your scraps in, and then I have a compost I'm gonna chuck that into a little bit later on. So everything essentially just gets used, you know what I mean? So in order to do the fermentation process, you're going to need a digital scale that reads in grams. You'll also need an empty mason jar, and then some sort of a fermentation rate. You could buy those all day long on Amazon. I'll leave a couple links in the description for you if you want to check some of those ones out. Otherwise, you could just use like some sort of a ramekin or a glass dish to kind of keep your ingredients weighed down. And it's a very important step. There's a couple different ways that you could go about doing this. This is my preferred way to lacto ferment, which is weighing everything out. To me, it just makes the most sense, and it's always accurate and consistent. I have some brine from a previous ferment, like I said a little bit earlier, that we're going to use. This actually does not get calculated into the final weight, so I'm going to tear the scale, which just basically means zero it out, and then we can start adding ingredients in. So I'm going to go in the garlic first. Doesn't really matter, as long as everything is in the jar, right? Now are you going with the peppers? I'm going to use some water. I like using bottled spring water, or I have a Brita filter that I also like to use. Fill up the jar just to let you have headroom in there, so when you put your fermentation weight, that water level doesn't overspill on the top of the jar. So you're going to take 677 grams and multiply that by 2.5%, which equals 16.925 grams. And that's going to be the amount of fine sea salt that we're going to need in order to make the brine. If you don't have a scale that reads in decimal points, you could round to the nearest whole number. That's perfectly acceptable too. Next step, we grab a mixing bowl and pour out some of this liquid and put a cup on the scale, set it to grams, zero it out once again. And then I'm using fine sea salt, no additives. It's not iodized, which is my preferred salt. And then go 17 grams of salt. Grab this bowl with water, put your salt in there, mix up the salt, dissolve it. And then pour the water back into the jar. This is our brine, right? Like I said, I'm using this as a fermentation weight. You really want to keep these ingredients submerged underneath that brine level. That's very important. That's called an anaerobic environment, which is where the lactic acid bacteria is able to survive and thrive. And it is salt tolerant up to a certain point too. So the salt is there to ward off any kind of bad bacteria that might develop in the brine as we're fermenting, right? And then I like to put a little bit of water into that dish just to weigh it down. That's it. I like this lid. It has a rubber flap on it, so gases are able to escape. As you're fermenting, you're gonna create some gas in there that needs to be released. So I fermented this for 1 month in my pantry away from direct sunlight at room temperature, right? 68 to 75 degrees I found is the best range for lacto ferments. And I like to keep this on a glass dish just in case there's any kind of overspill. There may or may not be. As this becomes active, it's gonna bubble. It's gonna look a lot like lazy carbonation, which I call it, or it's just gonna collect some tiny bubbles on the outside of the peppers or in some sort of a spot on the jar where they get caught. That's a good sign. Here's what it looks like when it's all said and done. Narrower mouth jar, actually use a Ziploc bag filled with water. That works too. And before I do get crazy with making the sauce, I want to check the pH on it. This is the only way to make sure that the fermentation process actually did what I wanted it to do. I'm looking for anything less than 4.6. This is reading right at 3.5, well below that 4.6 threshold. That's beautiful. That tells me that the fermentation process was successful. This is gonna be a cooked sauce, so the whole jar is gonna get put into a stock pot. The reason why I'm cooking this is because these chilies need to soften up just a little bit more. I mean, they're soft, but I need to have them a little bit softer. Cooking it does a couple things. It halts that fermentation process, which I want because I want the flavor of the sauce to be where it's at. If it keeps fermenting, then the flavors kind of change and develop over time, which I don't want because I like the flavor where it's at. Number two is those peppers themselves. They're from dried peppers, so they're still a little tough, and I want to be able to blend it up a little bit better. This is actually pretty beneficial that I'm doing this outside too, because these are spicier peppers and the fumes coming off of the pot is going to go in the air and it's going to irritate your eyes, irritate your sinuses, that kind of thing. If you're doing it inside, just make sure you have an open window, you have your hood vents going on, and you could also put a lid on the pot too that traps those fumes. So it's been about 10 minutes. This thing's ready to be blended up. Smells awesome, dude. I love it. I like smoother hot sauces too, so I'm gonna strain mine out. Just have a fine mesh strainer placed over a mixing bowl. That has a nice color on it. I like that a lot. I'm gonna use a small ladle to lightly work that sauce through the fine mesh strainer. Any seeds that remaining get left behind, and the pulp. It has a really nice consistency on it too. It'll thicken up ever so slightly after it cools down a little bit too. Ooh, that is tasty. It's nice and spicy, and it has a nice little like funkiness to it from the fermentation process. You can taste the onions and the garlic in there too. And those peppers are really, really pungent, really, really well flavored. And it has a beautiful, beautiful spice level to it. So I like to store my sauces in mason jars. You could use hot sauce bottles too if you want. After this cools down a little bit, I'm gonna check the pH once again to make sure that it's still underneath that 4.6, which I couldn't really imagine why it wouldn't be. That being said, this sauce is gonna last for a very long time in your refrigerator. I've had batches of fermented hot sauces in my refrigerator for upwards about a year and a half, and they're still going strong. As long as that pH is low, you know, 3.4, 3.7 range, something like that, your sauce is gonna last a very, very long time. But for how good the sauce is, I highly doubt you'll have it longer than like a month, because this sauce is absolutely delicious.